about now.
You're stressing then that self-consciousness about language, in fact, goes back quite a long way in philosophy, probably further than it does in the arts, with poetry and so on. Now, what were the specifically philosophical developments that brought it to a head in this century in the way that it...
Right. Well, now that is a marvelously complicated subject. Let me pick out a couple of strands in that. First of all, there's a historical development. Descartes, over 3 centuries ago, asked this basic question in philosophy: what is knowledge? How is knowledge possible? And I think if you take that question very seriously, and we have in philosophy, that has been the central question for the centuries after Descartes, eventually that leads you to what will, I think, almost inevitably seem a more fundamental question, namely, how does our mind represent the world at all? The question of what is meaning has come to seem prior to the question, what is knowledge? And there's certain specific historical features that led to that. Particularly, I would say, the work of Frege in the 19th century, the German philosopher and mathematician, and the work of Russell in the early 20th century. And both of them were engaged in an investigation of the foundations of mathematics and the nature of mathematical knowledge, and they were led to develop certain theories about the nature of linguistic representation. In order to answer questions about the nature of mathematics and what goes on in mathematical statements, they were led to fundamental questions about the nature of statement making.
Well, how? I mean, what is the connection between mathematical knowledge, which would seem to be purely abstract and carried out in Greek symbols and so on? What is the connection between that and ordinary statements of the kind that philosophers now analyze?
Well, there are numerous connections, but one basic connection was what is the nature of mathematical truth. And both Frege and Russell argued that mathematics was really an extension of logic, that the statements of mathematics were true in a sense by definition, and in order to develop that, they needed a theory of truth and a theory of logic, and already now we're in the philosophy of language when they begin to develop that.
So in other words, it's investigation into truth, which develops into an investigation into meaning and hence an analysis of statements, sentences, and so on.
Historically, I think it went that way.
How did we get from Russell at the turn of the century to now?
I think we can identify several lines of development, and oddly enough, Wittgenstein tends to play a crucial role in more than one of them. There's one line of development that goes from early Wittgenstein through the logical positivists like Carnap, and I think one would include Russell's work in this line as well, up to the present day in the works of philosophers like Quine and Davidson. Now, in that line is mostly concerned with the relationship between meaning and truth. And the crucial question tends to be, what are the truth conditions of an utterance? They are mostly concerned with conditions for establishing or determining the truth of sentences, and obviously this line will be more closely connected with the philosophy of science. Now, another line, which is the later Wittgenstein, and also the work of philosophers like Austin and Grice, and I think I would include myself in this, is more concerned with questions of linguistic use, with language seen as a part of human behavior. And the crucial question there is not what is the relation between meaning and truth, but what is the relation between meaning and use, or meaning and the intentions with which a speaker makes an utterance? Now, those are two lines that I see developing. I don't want to give you the impression that they're completely independent. No, they overlap and intertwine and interact in all sorts of ways. But then there's a third line that has come to seem very prominent in recent years, and that is the science of linguistics, of which Chomsky's name is the most prominent among contemporary linguists, has come to interact with philosophy in ways that were not the case until really quite recently, until after 1957.
You've made so many important points at once, Professor Searle, that I think it will be helpful if I sort of, so to speak, recapitulate before we start moving ahead. We're considering language, this amazing phenomenon of words and utterances and noises that is so fundamental to our humanity and to the way we cope with life and see the world and everything. Now, you might say there are two main ends to this process. There is the relationship of language to the world, the relationship of language to its objects, to all the things in the world that we talk about. And there is also the relationship of language to the language user, So this gives, as it were, two lines of development in the history of the subject we're considering. One lot of people have concentrated on discussing the relation of words to their objects, and what that leads them to do is to analyze sentences and statements. It leads them to consider above all else the question of under what conditions can statements be said to be true or false, and that leads them to develop formal criteria of truth and so on. That's one line of development that you mentioned, and you named Russell, the early Wittgenstein, Carnap and Davidson as being the main people in that line. And Quine, of course, yes. Now, the other line of development is interestingly different from that. That considers the subjects of language, not the objects of language. In other words, the human beings using language. And the questions there are about their intentions. What are they using language for? What are their purposes? And now you didn't say who the main people in that line of development were, but I take
No, I did. Later Wittgenstein,
the later Wittgenstein,
Austin, and I would include de Grijs and Strawson and other people as well.
Yes. And so those are the two main lines of development of the philosophy of language, and then as a sort of third, you threw in Chomsky and
I didn't throw it in. It comes charging in.
It comes charging in. Well, now, right. Now, we've so to speak, we've got that sketch map of the field.
Right.
Now, for clarity's sake, let's take these one at a time. Now, let's start by discussing the school of thought that is interested in the relationship between language and its objects. In other words, to use the most famous phrase, words and things. Mm-hmm. Can you unpack that a little?
Well, let me. Should I do it by way of telling you something about the central figures? I think perhaps that's one way to go about it.
Yeah.
Well, an epoch-making book in this field is Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and he there articulates a very powerful theory of language. That language sentences consist for him as consist of being in effect pictures. They're conventionalized pictures of facts. Not that they actually look like the fact, but that the relation between the way a sentence represents and the way a picture represents is structurally quite close. And then this picture theory of meaning, as it was called, formed the basis of his theory of language. Now, he came to reject that later, but that had a powerful influence. His book, The Tractatus, had a powerful influence on a school of philosophers who were known as the logical positivists, and their center was in Vienna between the wars. And they, I think, at least partly misunderstanding Wittgenstein, took the question of verification. How do we verify a proposition as the central question in meaning? And their slogan was called the verification principle. And the question that they asked, the crucial question, was, in order to know what a sentence means, what must we do to find out whether or not it's true? This was one way of putting the claim that the meaning of a statement is its method of verification. And they accepted the idea that all statements are either analytic or synthetic. The leading figure in this group, and perhaps the leading figure, is Carnap. And Carnap, though his views changed a great deal over the years, I think is primarily famous for this conception of language. That is, that language consists in statements, it primarily consists in statements that are true or false, and that their meaning is intimately connected with their method of verification in such a way that we can define meaning in terms of verification. Now then, when we get to more recent times, when we get to Quine is most famous. His single most famous work was an attack on the distinction between on the analytic synthetic distinction. That is, he attacks the idea that we can make a clear distinction between that truth which is in virtue of meaning and that which is in virtue of matters of fact. And this then led in his more recent work to what I could only describe as a general rejection of the notion of meaning. Quine adopts a behavioristic conception of language. He sees us as beings who are bombarded by stimuli, verbal and otherwise, and then we make verbal responses. And all there really amounts to meaning is our dispositions to respond verbally. There isn't, in addition to these dispositions to verbal responses, anything called meanings going through our mind. So Quine's behaviorism is closely connected with his empiricism, But ironically, it led him to reject what had seemed one of the foundation stones of an earlier generation of empiricists, namely the distinction between analytic and synthetic proposition. His famous article is called Two Dogmas of Empiricism.